Hello students, welcome back to the channel. Students, in this video we are going to discuss the types of vectors. This topic is very important for class 11th physics and for class 12th mathematics. You are going to use this topic in both these subjects and classes. So let's start. You all know that a vector quantity is something which has both magnitude as well as direction. So this is suppose a vector, and every vector has a tail and a head. So this is the tail. This part of the vector is called the tail of the vector, and this part of the vector is called the head of the vector, right? So any physical quantity which has both magnitude and direction, it is called a vector quantity. For example, displacement has both magnitude and direction. Velocity, acceleration, force, momentum, torque, all these are vector quantities because all these quantities have both magnitude as well as directions. So there are various categories of vectors, there are various types of vectors. We are going to discuss each and every type in this video. So broadly, we can divide vectors into two categories, and these are the two categories, which are polar vectors and axial vectors. What are polar vectors? The vectors which have a starting point or a point of application are called polar vectors. For example, displacement, velocity and force. Any vector which has a starting point and a point of application, that is called a polar vector. For example, let's take the example of force, right? Suppose we have a body kept on some surface, right? This is a body and this body is kept on, suppose, this surface, right? So when we apply a force on this body, so we will say that this force has a point of application. This force is acting at this particular point. So either the vector has a point of application or it is starting from a fixed point. That type of vector is called polar vector, right? Position vector is also a polar vector because the starting point of position vector is origin and the terminal point, that is the head of the vector, right? The starting point, the tail of the vector of position vector of a point is at origin and head is at that point whose position vector is this vector, right? So any vector which has some fixed starting point or some fixed terminal point or point of application, that is called a polar vector. Other type of vectors are axial vectors. Axial vectors are those which act along the axis of rotation. The vectors which represent rotational effect and act along the axis of rotation in accordance with right hand screw rule are called axial vectors. For example, you all must be knowing the concept of torque. What is the direction of torque? Direction of torque is given by, if you do not know this concept, that's okay, but you will get an idea. Torque is a vector which is given as the product of the cross product of R and F. If a body is rotating about an axis, this body is rotating about an axis, and this is rotating because we have applied a force, a tangential force like this, right? Like this. And this, so this is the force vector, and this is the position vector of the point where the force is applied with respect to the axis of rotation, right? So torque is the cross product of R and F. So if we find, if the body is rotating like this, that is in anti-clockwise direction, so the value of cross product is given as like this. You have to curl your fingers from R to F. Suppose R is this and F is this, so you have to curl your fingers from R to F and you will get, the thumb will give you the direction of the torque. So there are some vectors which act along the axis of rotation. For example, torque, angular velocity, angular acceleration, angular momentum, all these vectors do not have any fixed point of application. They are not acting at a fixed point or they are not having any starting point. They are just acting along an axis. So they are called axial vectors. Vectors which are acting along the axis when the body is rotating They are called axial vectors. Okay. Then come equal vectors. Vectors are said to be equal if they have same magnitude and same direction. Two vectors, suppose we have two vectors 1 and 2. Now if you look closely, both these vectors have same magnitude and they are parallel to each other, that is they are acting along the same directions. So in diagrams of vectors, the length of the vector decides the magnitude of the vector. So if the length of these two vectors, the length of these two lines is same, length of these two arrows is same, then they are representing two vectors having same magnitude. So these two vectors have same magnitude and they are acting along the same straight line. So they have same magnitude and they have same direction. These vectors are called equal vectors. Then unit vector. A unit vector is simply a vector whose magnitude is 1. Suppose you will say a velocity of 1 meter per second. So velocity is a vector and magnitude is 1. So it represents a unit vector, right? For example, if we have a vector A which is xi cap plus yj cap plus zk cap, right? This is a vector xi cap plus yj cap plus zk cap. So these I cap, j cap and k caps are what? These I cap, j cap and k caps are the unit vectors along x axis, y axis and z axis respectively, right? So the magnitude of this vector along x axis is xi cap and along y axis y, just the magnitude, right? The magnitude of this vector along x axis is x and the unit vector along x axis is I cap. So the total magnitude of this vector along x axis is xi cap and magnitude of this vector along y axis is y, and since unit vector along y axis is j cap, so the total magnitude, the vector of this component of this vector along y axis is yj cap and component of this vector along z axis is zk cap. So this I cap, j cap and k cap are the vectors which are acting along x axis, y axis and z axis and they are having a magnitude of 1 unit. Such vectors are called unit vectors. You can find unit vector in any direction. Suppose we have to find unit vector in the direction of this A. We have to find a unit vector in the direction of this A. So we will simply write unit vector as A with this sign over the head of the symbol of the vector, and this sign is called hat or cap. Any unit vector is represented by putting a hat or cap on the head of the symbol of the vector, and normally a vector is represented by putting an arrow sign over the head of the vector, right? But we are not going into the details because this video is just for the types of vectors. So unit vector, you can find unit vector by dividing any vector by its magnitude, and you all must be knowing that the magnitude of a vector is nothing but under root the square of coefficient of I plus square of coefficient of j plus square of coefficient of k, right? So this is the unit vector. What is a fixed vector? A fixed vector is a vector whose initial point is fixed. Like when you take position vector of any point, what you do? You fix the initial point of the position vector as origin, right? If this is the y-axis and this is the x-axis and here we have a point P, so what is the position vector of this point? Position vector is simply a vector drawn from origin to this point. So this yellow line is the position vector of P. So to make position vector of any point, the tail is kept at the origin. So to take the position vector of any point, we say that the initial point of the vector is fixed and that point is the origin, right? So such type of vectors whose initial point is fixed, that is called fixed vector. and there are other vectors whose initial points are not fixed. They are called free vectors. For example, velocity vector is a free vector because if a body is moving, it can turn in this direction, it can turn in this direction. So we cannot fix the initial point of velocity vector of a body. So such vectors are called free vectors, right? Then collinear vectors. What are collinear vectors? Vectors which act along the same line are called collinear vectors. For example, this vector and this vector, both these vectors are collinear vectors. Earlier we have studied about equal vectors, so those vectors were having same magnitude and direction. Now we are saying that collinear vectors are the vectors which act along the same line, right? And that same line can be in opposite direction also. For example, let us take another vector, this one. So all these three vectors are acting along the same line, but they have different magnitudes and they can have opposite directions. So all these three vectors which are acting along the same line, they are collinear vectors. Next is coplanar vectors. Coplanar vectors are vectors which act in the same plane. For example, this is a plane of the board. So any vector which is drawn in this plane, any two vectors which are drawn in this plane, this, and these three also, all these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 3, 8, all these 8 vectors are coplanar vectors because they are acting in the same plane. That is the plane of this board. Co-initial vectors. Co-initial vectors are the vectors which have same initial point. Co-initial vectors are the vectors which have same initial point. For example, these two vectors are co-initial because they have same initial point. This is the initial point of the vectors and the initial point of both these vectors is common. So they are called co-initial vectors. Coterminous vectors. Next set of vectors are coterminous vectors. Vectors which have same terminal point. For example, take these two vectors. So these two vectors are starting from two different points, but they are terminating at a common point, this one, right? So these vectors are called coterminous vectors. Next is zero vector or null vector. This is a vector which has zero magnitude. So a vector of no magnitude, a vector whose magnitude is zero, that is called zero vector or null vector. So it can have any arbitrary direction because if the magnitude is 0, that means the vector is not there, vector is not present. But it is an important vector because when we take resultant of two vectors, this vector has an important meaning. So we will go into that when we will discuss the addition of vectors or how we find the resultant of two vectors. But these are the types of vectors that you are going to study in class 11th physics and class 12th mathematics. So you must be knowing all these terms very carefully to understand the concepts of vectors that you are going to study after this lecture. So I will meet you in those lectures. Till then, all the very best.